Welcome to this tutorial on starting the AJS37 Viggen from cold and configuring it for departure. We will go over an expedited cold start procedure, including correct engine parameters, a further simplified arcade version of the cold start procedure, a suggested method for configuring the aircraft's systems for taxiing, and the basics of loading a mission editor created flight plan from a data cartridge into the Viggen's computer systems. Hello fellow virtual aviators, we are back in the AJS37 Viggen, and today we will be looking at the principles of preparing for our flights, starting the aircraft up from cold and loading our flight plan into the CK37 central computer. Now, as usual with our aircraft start tutorials, our main focus will be looking at an expedited cold start procedure of my own preference, rather than the full from the manual checklist. We may sprinkle in a few wholly unnecessary steps to add a bit of flavour, but in general, the procedures we'll look at today will be enough to get the Viggen ready for action from a fresh spawn. We will also go through what I like to call the arcade cold start. That is the absolute minimum that you will need to do if you spawn into a multiplayer server to get the aircraft going if your motives are impatiently questionable. Many of the switches required during startup are already in the correct positions when the aircraft spawns, so some of the real-world essential steps will be omitted in both the expedited and arcade procedures. But, as with everything in the Viggen, these systems have been designed to reduce pilot workload, so these procedures are very simple and straightforward. The aircraft does most of the work itself. I like to think of the cold start procedure as being in two phases. The firing of the engine to provide power to the systems, followed by the programming of the computer. Again, this is not strictly true if we're going by the book, but it is a fair assessment when performing a quick startup. So let's take a look at these procedures and learn how to fire up this awesome aircraft. First, he's the exceedingly naughty arcade startup. If you're not interested in doing even a remotely decent job, just want to get to the runway as quickly as possible, and assuming all these switches are in their default spawn positions. So first, let's close the canopy. Put our main power switch on and silence the alarm. Open the lower pressure fuel valve pump. Throttle out of stop and into idle. Switch on the generator and switch on engine start. Whilst that's happening, we'll open the oxygen valve and arm the ejector seat. We're then going to wait for about half a minute for all the other systems to power up and erect. Once the CK37 central computer's data panel springs to life, which we will know as it will be displaying data on its display, we are ready to program our flight plan. Now, as that was somewhat embarrassing, we'll now go through my preferred expedited cold start procedure with a little more explanation and exposition. So, before doing anything, having defined our mission, I would normally rearm and refuel at this stage, using the usual menu. In this instance, we will not equip any stores and proceed onwards to the startup procedure. First, some preliminary checks. We'll make sure that the parking brake is set, indicated by this lever here being pulled out. If it is not, as we can see here, to set the parking brake, we depress the toe brakes fully, pull out the parking brake lever, and then quickly release the pedals. We will quickly check that the landing gear lever is down, and that the auto throttle lever is up in the FRON or off position. We'll also ensure that the master mode selector is set to BER, BER, standing for beredskap, the Swedish word for readiness or standby. This will allow us to work with the CK37 without it thinking that we have started our mission. Although the next step can be done at any time up until takeoff, let's now close the canopy by placing the lever into the forward position. This will pop forward another step once the canopy is sealed. In the Expedited start, we are starting the aircraft here without ground power. This means we will be working with the charge stored in the Viggen's battery, which according to the manual gives us between 3 and 7 minutes to get the engine started, after which the AC generator will provide the necessary power to the systems. So we will first place the main power switch, or huvudström switch, into the till or on position. This will sound the master warning, which we will silence using the button on the front dash labelled Huvudvarning here. With the main power switch on, various amber lights on the warning tables will illuminate and flash, specifically indicating no AC power, low fuel pressure, low hydraulic system pressure, the tank pump system being inoperative, and low engine oil pressure. And lack of operation in the pilot's oxygen system, an inoperative radar altimeter, an inoperative central computer, and that the canopy and/or ejector seat are not correctly set. This is all normal at this stage. We will open the low-pressure fuel valve, labelled LT Kran, by placing the switch into the till or on position, which should extinguish the adjacent red light. Next, we will move the throttle out of stop and into the ground idle position. This can be done by clicking the catch on the front left of the throttle, or if you have a throttle with a detent and detent switch, it can be done as a bind. Moving the throttle out of stop will at the same time open the high-pressure fuel valve. We will illuminate the anti-collision beacon, labelled Anti-Col Ljus, by placing the switch into the till or on position, to warn others around us that we are about to start the engine. We will set the generator switch to the till or on position, and then we will set the engine start switch to the T-till or on position. This will then fire the engine and will return to the F-fron or off position once the engine is idling. The switch is supposed to be held for at least 2 seconds before it holds its own position at on itself, but is currently modelled as a simple toggle. Within 5 seconds, Start Sist should illuminate on the right warning light table, to indicate that the start process is running. As the engine starts, we will monitor its condition. Approximately 15 seconds after setting the engine start switch, the RPM will begin to rise. Manual fuel regulation will end with the extinguishment of the MAN BR Reg warning light. At approximately the same time, around 10% RPM, the Tend Sist warning light will begin to flash, to indicate that the ignition system is active. At approximately 20% RPM, there will be a sudden RPM surge as the engine is ignited. The exhaust gas temperature gauge will begin to rise, but should not exceed 400 degrees Celsius. If it does, set the throttle back to the off position, and the engine start switch to the F-fron or off position also. The Start Sist and Tend Sist lights will have extinguished just before the engine reaches ground idle status. At this stage, we will check that the engine is ticking over within safe parameters. RPM at idle should sit between 55 and 65%. The engine pressure ratio should read at approximately 1. The exhaust gas temperature should be no greater than 350 degrees at idle, although I have observed this at slightly higher than this limit, with no discernible problems created after taxi and takeoff. The nozzle indicator should be fully open, indicated by the needle being in the fully right position. With the engine idling and the AC generator now providing electrical power to the aircraft's systems, we can now get the aircraft configured. Many systems will continue to initiate and configure without further pilot input, now that AC and hydraulic power have been established. In normal circumstances, within 1 minute of startup, at this stage all of the amber warning lights will have extinguished, save from the sear gas pilot's oxygen warning and the Huv o stall canopy and ejector seat warning. As usual, what I tend to do is sweep along the left console, then sweep across the front dash and its periphery, and finish by sweeping along the right console. Many of the steps we will do, and many that we will omit, are supposed to be done at different stages in the startup procedure, especially when working with ground power, but I find this flow works for me in most scenarios. So, starting on the left, we'll set our interior lights as required with the knobs on this panel here. We'll turn up the volume of our radio and ensure that the mode selector for the FR24 radio is set to Norm plus Larm. We will also turn up the volume of our RWR and Sidewinder growl with this knob here, something we can always adjust later. We'll set our radio channel on the FR22 radio here. Obviously we will go through full radio use in a future tutorial, but let's, for example, choose special channel 3. We'll set our taxi light by placing this switch here into the aft position. We'll recenter the roll trim by pressing and holding this button for a few seconds. And check that the pitch trim is a few degrees nose up. This we will adjust later prior to taxi and takeoff. On the front dash, we'll calibrate our altimeter to the QFE of our home airbase. This can be found on the kneeboard, so let's bring up the kneeboard, and we can see there in the top block that the QFE is 1006, so let's set that. Now, I prefer to set the backup altimeter to the current QNH, which is also found on the kneeboard there, 1013. So let's calibrate our backup altimeter to that. We'll double check the fuel level, which unusually should be a few percentage points above 100%. This is perfectly normal. Nominal parameters should be plus or minus 5% of 106% fuel, or 131% if you have the external fuel tank equipped. Next we will check that the ADI has properly aligned, and we'll fast direct our backup artificial horizon using this knob here if required. And finally, we will check that the SPAC flight dampening system is switched on with this illuminated button here. Moving over to the right console, we'll open the pilot's oxygen valve by moving this lever into the upwards till or on position. This should extinguish the amber sear gas warning light on the right table. Next we will double check that the radar altimeter is switched on with the RHM switch in the forward till or on position. For the time being, we'll forego setting any weapons parameters, but I would at this point set up any countermeasures using the panels here. We'll set any remaining exterior lighting with the switches on this panel here as desired. And finally, we'll arm the ejection seat with the lever above our heads, reaching back and moving it into the lateral position, thereby extinguishing the hood o stall amber light on the right warning table. If all is well, all of the lights on the warning tables should now have extinguished, with the exception of the 3 green NOS-stel, V-stel and HOR-stel, which indicate our landing gear are down and locked. The only exception to this is if an external fuel tank is equipped. In such a case, the amber X-Tank-Bre light will also be illuminated at this stage. This will disappear as we spool up over 70% RPM. With our Viggen now configured, our next step is to load our flight plan into the CK37 central computer via the data panel. In our next tutorial, we will be looking at the various different ways in which the flight plan can be programmed, but here we will simply look at the most basic version, that which has been programmed using the mission editor. In the real aircraft, flight plans would be programmed and stored on a data cartridge. The simulation in DCS World allows us to choose from many different cartridges that we have saved. So our first task is to select which cartridge we wish to use, and this is done on the kneeboard. So if we bring up the kneeboard and advance to this page here, we can see that the selected cartridge is 0 Mission Editor. In other words, the plan of waypoints that have been assigned to the aircraft when the mission was created. Other cartridges can be selected, which we will talk about in our upcoming tutorials, but for now we will simply use the Mission Editor's version. With this selected, we can see a summary of the flight plan on the pilot's sign-out sheet here. Again, something to discuss in more depth in our upcoming tutorials. The sheet shows each individual waypoint and various parameters associated with them. With the cartridge choice made on the kneeboard, we can reach back to the left of our seat and insert the cartridge into its slot here. We then need to tell the CK37 to read the information on the cartridge and load it into the computer system, which is done with data reference 9099. First, we set the data mode selector dial to ref lola, and the input-output switch to in, as we need to input a reference. Next, we type the reference code 9099 into the first 4 digits of the display, and then press the LS SKU button on the navigation panel to run the load procedure. The first digit 9 flashes to indicate that the data transfer is underway. When successfully complete, the digits will display sextuple 0. If this does not display, but the first digit 9 stops flashing, data transfer has been unsuccessful and should be re-attempted. Once data transfer is complete, return the mode selector and input-output switch to their default act pause and out positions. At minimum, a flight plan must have the location of the departure airfield programmed, which, if the Viggen is set to spawn on the ground at an airfield, should automatically and correctly be added to the data cartridge. We can check this by reading the information stored under the LS Landningsfelt Start or Departure Airbase waypoint. LS should be displayed on the destination indicator to show the selected waypoint. If it is not, press the LS SKU button on the navigation panel to select it. Then place the data mode selector into the ref lola position, but leave the input-output switch set to out. This will either show the coordinates or the reference associated with the LS waypoint. Here on the display, we see a 4-digit reference number beginning with the number 9, in this case 9016. Each airbase on each DCS World map is assigned a reference code, as they would have been in real life for the theatre in which the Viggen was employed. We are currently sat on the ramp at Incirlik Air Force Base in southern Turkey, and we can cross-reference this using a list found on the kneeboard. So let's bring up the kneeboard, advance to this page here, and use the kneeboard next and previous subpage commands to cycle through the list and find the code. As we can see, 9016 corresponds to Incirlik, meaning that our departure airbase has been correctly programmed. With this confirmed, let's return the switches to their default positions. Various other checks can be made to ensure the data for the other waypoints is correct, but for now we have all the minimally necessary data to allow us to depart. Well, as ever, I hope that was useful for you. We have covered enough to get you ready for departure, but a wise man once said to me that learning the Viggen is like going down a rabbit hole, and we will see in our upcoming tutorials that we have just scratched the surface, especially when it comes to flight plan data. With heartfelt gratitude to my patrons, especially Jan11, Lakota21, Plabs, Starlover, and Ben, and indeed everyone who supports the channel via Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee. Feel free to do the usual thing like subscribe, comment and share, but until next time, virtual aviators, keep on rocking and keep on flying. This is Reiver saying last call.